Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a wonderful session in the previous presentation slots. Now we are moving on to our fourth talk. As we all know, the coronavirus pandemic has adversely affected the education process globally, but the internet has come out as a savior. As soon as the COVID-19 crisis broke out, most of the world's universities shifted to conducting online classes. And we started sharing study materials and audio files with students over the internet. Online education, that was earlier seen as a low priority experiment for institutions, has been adopted by both faculty and students everywhere. For our next session, we have with us Payal Arora, who is professor and chair in technology values and global media cultures at Erasmus University Rotterdam. Payal is the founder of Catalyst Lab, a digital storytelling organization, and she is the lead investigator for the Feminist Approaches to Labor Collectives project. Payal is a digital anthropologist and author of award-winning book, including one of her books is The Next Billion Users, which is published by Harvard Press. She's an expert in digital experience and informal learning among low-income communities. Forbes named her the next billion champion and the right kind of person to reform tech. Payal's work has been appreciated by BBC, The Economist, Quartz, TechCrunch, the Boston Globe, The Nation, and CBC. She received prestigious Teacher of the Year award in higher education across the Netherlands for introducing novel blended learning strategies. We are really glad to have Payal Arora with us. And today she is going to speak on online education in the COVID-19 era. Thank you very much, Payal, for joining us. Over to you now.
Thank you so much, Tarun. And hello, everyone. It's so wonderful to be here. And I know it's a Saturday, so that's an extra plus to you guys that you really feel this is something which is essential and important to you. So I'm very much honored to be part of this conversation. So, let me just, the idea here for this is that I'm going to give a sort of a backdrop, but I'm really hoping we can have a conversation on this as we move forward and use this time effectively. So indeed, as Tarun said, I wrote a book recently called The Next Billion Users. And this really focuses on the new population coming online because of dramatic changes in the last few years in terms of data plans, cheap mobile phones, which has really enabled people who are at the margins, which I call the marginalized majority. If you think about it, more than half the world's population are low-income populations. And so this is the next billion users. And just between India and China alone, they make the next web. We're talking about 80% of young people coming online and constituting the majority of the users in the world, just between these two countries. And remember, they have not even scratched the surface. We're talking about India has not even optimized about 30% and China 45%. So there's so much more to go, right? So in this sort of mind frame, what does education look like, particularly as people can leverage on these very basic tools that they seem to access, and can they leverage it in a way that is enhancing of their well-being, their knowledge structures, and the way they connect with each other through information infrastructures, right? So, for us to understand what is being disrupted in this pandemic, we need to take a step back, because there's a lot of conversation of disruption, right? And part of the reason is that we need to be able to look at it as something which is not a very dichotomous, like pre and post COVID, because actually three little segments that I would like to focus on, which is worth sort of giving thought to as we proceed further, is the role of democracy in public education, formal and informal education, and self-organized learning and self-optimization, for us to understand the trajectory of where education is going to go and what does this mean for the everyday person, right? So, it is worth telling ourselves that indeed the idea of a public education wasn't around forever. it was actually a 21st century innovation, which really had a radical idea that education is not for the elite, which was, by the way, for centuries, that, the mindset that only a small segment of the society needs to be educated and the rest of the masses are not, like, it's not needed, because also they would cause too much trouble, and that was not their right. And we've come very far, right? But we should not forget that it was a 21st century innovation, the idea that the public deserves an education, and that in fact, it is related to democracy, because if an everyday person can get an education, which is basically about socialization of their civic responsibilities, their connectivity with each other, their understanding of their history so as to move towards a future, then you can possibly have a more robust, humane system, right? And that is partly what the tie between democracy and public education is. And, especially for places like in the global South, which experienced colonialism for centuries, right? Many parts of Africa, Asia, case in point in India, it was instrumental in building nationhood. So we see that education is playing multiple roles in our lives, from our identity at a national level, our identity on a social level, and at a much more micro level, like, who am I, right? This whole idea of self-optimization, self-actualization. It's also important to see what is the relationship between the state and the corporation. Because as we've been looking at the privatization of education for a long time, there's been a lot of tension regarding that, right? Because the notion of a public is that it's a right-based entity and that it should be accessible. When I say accessible, it should be affordable. Often it is free or very, very subsidized by taxpayer money. But then you have the privatization of education, and this tension sort of manifests in the other question. It is not sufficient to just have access. It is about the quality of education. And in India, that has become a huge issue, is that attending and going into your classroom is not sufficient. In fact, there's too big a young population who said, this is not good enough. We need quality education because I need to have skills. I don't need a paper degree. I need to have the skills to be able to compete in this economy that is fast changing. It is datafying, there's automation. How do I prepare myself? And this can lead to high unemployment rates, right? Now, how does it tie to COVID? Is because the tension between the privatization of education and the statehood and the control over the platform, which is a classroom, is going online. And there is this notion of the platformization of education. And what I mean by that, for those, many of you probably already know about it, but in the last decade, there's a serious conversation about the platformization of our entire social life, not just education. We're talking about healthcare, education, our everyday social activities. And what we mean by that is whether we're using WhatsApp, our mobile phones, we are constantly making choices. Private companies, the big tech, right? Like a lot of from YouTube, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, all these are basically become the intermediaries between knowledge production and us. So it is sieving through, and it has gained an extraordinary power in society in terms of what constitutes as factual, what is information, what is knowledge, and it has diversified the kind of actors who can participate in knowledge making and the shaping of our worldviews, right? Which, by the way, used to be the purview of the state in terms of the school as an institution. So there's definitely that challenge of, who gets to dictate and shape our mind. Now, the platformization concern is that when you have private companies coming in and gathering data, so for example, during COVID times, let's get more specific, is that how do we make sure that children continue their education in spite of not being able to go to the classroom? And what happens when they are low-income populations, which are majority of the world's citizens, and in India also a substantive number. We have millions of them who are migrants, so they're not even at home. So you can't even talk about homeschooling because they're on the move. That there is a new kind of responsibility of, giving, top ups on data, because the mobile phone has become one of the key instruments to sort of upskill and to keep people connected on knowledge, right? And what's really interesting, especially for young people, is the formatting of knowledge has taken on a sort of an audiovisual format, like TikTok thought pieces, right? And a variety of different innovative ways in which we can communicate, engage, and gather sort of a conversation and a dialogue, right? If we optimize it correctly. But you can also see very quickly the deep problem and challenges we have, because here the state becomes subservient to a core group of oligarchies, right, in the technology industry that are not necessarily Indian based and are owning the data, which can also use this to create other educational platforms, which can be privatized, and thereby taking away less of the public and converting the public education into a private education, which puts to our question of how much of public education will really be public in this age of datafication. Now, the next leg is about the formal and informal learning. Now, in years ago, actually, this was one of my first projects. We're talking about more than a decade ago. I was part of the same language subtitling project, which was initiated by Bridge Kothari, who's from Pondicherry. They won a number of awards funded by World Bank, and in fact, Bill Clinton even made a remark on it, said that it was one of the most innovative and simple interventions which could do high impact on a variety of and a vast majority of the population around the world. And that's quite an endorsement. So I was a young researcher there, younger, and I was in the field. I was actually in Kuppam in Andhra Pradesh, in a small town, Chandrababu's constituency at that time. And the idea was really simple, because what we found in India was, it's not about, we had this framework of illiterates and literate, but actually a vast number of them are neo-literate who drop out of primary schooling or even secondary schooling and lapse into illiteracy. So how do you sustain literacy? Because look, our knowledge production and the way in which we train our mind needs to be nurtured. Knowledge is not a frozen entity. We need to constantly nurture our mind, right? And so the idea was super simple, is what if we were to put same language subtitling, basically karaoke, on television, right? So people are using and getting entertained, but they are constantly exposed to the text, but they don't see themselves as learning. So it is really an informal learning, and it became really impactful. And soon it has now been established a decade later in all the Darshan channels, and it has become established, but it took about a decade to become, incorporated. Now, the reason I bring this up right now is because now we have a variety of different digital spaces, particularly if you look at what's happening with TikTok, and if you look at the segment on rural life. It is a massive number of people. There's been massive millions of followers of rural celebrities who are teaching informal ways of learning. Because the truth is, India, like many other countries, we're talking about 60 to 70% of the economy are informal economies. And people don't have frozen knowledge. They need to constantly adapt to the changes. And COVID is one such massive, dramatic disruption, which is constantly creating new scenarios. So you also need to teach each other and learn from each other on an everyday level. It could be learning of the humbler kind, as where do we get rations? How do you navigate this technology? There's a problem here. Or about coping mechanisms, or about new kinds of industries. How do I initiate and be more entrepreneurial? Or sort of like let's be, what can I learn about the subject? So whatever it is, there's a host of knowledge out there. But of course, again, we have also it's a double-edged sword, right? You have misinformation, false information, hate speech, and that is a sort of a high amount of tension between who gets to curate, who gets to be the experts, who gets to be the teachers in this kind of informal curriculum. And last part before we get into the sort of a dialogue is self-organized learning and self-optimization. Now, I've been part of many kind of projects like this. And in fact, I've become one of the biggest critics of this. One such beloved project is Sugata Mitra, who has become quite a pop star about the hole in the wall in the 90s, right? And some of you may know this project, which was an idea, which was actually quite, radical of that time in a sense that Sugata Mitra put a computer in a hole in the wall in a slum in Delhi and with no instructions. So these kids had never seen something like a computer, right? And there's a camera and there was a sort of a mouse, that's it. And they documented what children do when they interface with something completely radical with no instructions. And very quickly, kids learned to play with it and they, navigated and they started to learn how to create files and they created their own even language for navigating it. And the point here, which the world got really excited about, is that, hey, guess what? Slum children are like everybody else's children. They are deeply curious, they're desperate and hungry to learn, and they figure things out in many ways. And it's not surprising, right? Many of you are parents and you've seen your kids take your mobile phone and do things which you couldn't even believe. And so this whole kind of digital native is there to some degree, but it has gone too far because this notion of self-organized learning is putting the responsibility of education onto the shoulders of the everyday individual, particularly on children. So when there is a failure, then it is self-responsibility becomes self-blame. And that is something that is not acceptable because as I research this long-term, there's a limit to self-organized learning, which is basically that, children up to a point find it cool, they will use their games, they will learn some stuff, and then they quickly resort to video games. And majority of what they learn is not necessarily educational. In fact, Bertrand Russell, one of the early 20th century philosophers, experimented on this very principle. He said, of course, children, they are so driven by curiosity, they teach themselves, including math, chemistry, etc. And a year later, he had to shut down the school because he said, well, given a choice between a child climbing a tree and doing math, they'll climb the tree. It's very few children who choose math. You need to excite them. You need to entice them. The role of the teacher becomes more critical than ever before. And how is that tied to COVID? Because right now, there's a lot of onus on self-organized learning and self-optimization. Of course, if you're more privileged and you have a lot of support mechanisms, you have educated parents, you have a home environment, which is, you have your own room, you have, a lot of other resources. Of course, that can actually be very enabling. But most people do not have those privileges. And then it becomes extraordinarily divisive in times of the COVID. And it creates a sort of a educational divide. So let me just conclude here based on the time is that we need to think in terms of what are the triggers for inclusive education. And indeed, we need to look at access, engagement, and also about the formation of values during COVID time, that it's not just about access to technology, but access to the right kinds of education, the kinds of values we are imparting. And even more so, we need to really think about, the big questions in mind, because as we see, education is also deeply political. We are in a very deeply entrenched political time. COVID is like a mirror to our face as we see the deep, extraordinary inequalities surface and come to our face as we see millions of migrants take to the streets and walk back to their villages in India. And we see that happening around the world. We see deep inequality, and it is kind of a reflective moment. We need to use education as a forum where it's not about imparting knowledge, but how do we instrumentalize knowledge to create a better value system so we can address this as a community where we can really introspect, right? We need to also think about the role of lifelong learning. It's not about, and which means that it's not about, oh, adult learning as, you know, what's come to be, or upskilling. It's about the idea that let's not have deep arrogance that school, university is, you know, establishing certain kind of corpus of data, certain kind of corpus of knowledge, and then I'm the expert, because times are changing, expertise changes. We need to teach children not the knowledge, but how to deal with this kind of knowledge, the skills and processes to be flexible learning, critical thinking, and those are transferable. And that allows for lifelong learning of how do I engage as a community, how do I build my character, and how do I contribute to something bigger than me, right? And last is in terms of taking the role of technology in this, is that we've got to stop thinking about it as some sort of autonomous sort of tech that, you know, that we can become completely autonomous once we have this or that, because it's still embedded in a bigger ecosystem of an educational infrastructure, which requires financial incentives. So, you know, we need to rethink and be critical about where the money is coming from. The cultural incentives, what kind of curriculum? Is it getting too nationalistic? Is it getting too political? Is it allowing for a critical character? And we need to go beyond the neoliberal frameworks by questioning the platformization of education, because let's not give up on the public education as yet, because that is one of the biggest achievements and accomplishments of humanity. And let's hold on to it and nurture it in a way that makes sense in India and for particularly the most vulnerable populations across board. So I would like to end here, and I'm very happy to have a conversation on this. And if you'd like to stay in touch, I'm on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. So yeah, you can find me there. And I will stop sharing the screen and we can get back to a conversation.
Yes. So if we have any questions, Payal has, you know, like spared 15 minutes for the Q&A, and I'm sure many of us are going to have plenty of questions. Payal, could I read out the questions to you?
Of course, yeah.
Yes. Ms. Pronima Bakchi is asking, could you please shed some light on socialization in online education?
Okay. Okay, so we have 15 minutes, so I'll be quick, okay?
Yes.
Respectful of the others. But socialization, you know, it comes from this whole, there's many scholars have thought about it, whether it's John Dewey in the educational field too. Actually, our good old Krishnamurti, when I was growing up, I read a lot of Krishnamurti. I don't know if some of you have read his books, but the idea is that socialization is about the kind of character we want of ourselves, our children, and of our society. And, you know, the beautiful thing about human nature is we are on average limited by our abilities. But the unique thing about human nature is we want to aspire to be a particular better version of ourselves, right, a better version of our society. So socialization is not about let's, you know, reproduce knowledge of this generation to the next generation. No parent wants that. We want to make sure that our next generation will be somehow better than us, that they don't need to think about the kind of issues, tackle the kind of issues. We want a better even playing field, which is why, by the way, the whole Black Lives Matter has resonated around the world, because there's such an outrage that why is this generation still talking about the growing global inequality, for example, right? And this also taps into the education and the divides in the education. But I hope that at least triggers it to some, yes, you know.
Rakesh Banod from London saying, education for liberation or for it's domestication. Please comment in relation to ELT, that's English language teaching.
So indeed, you know, the politics of English and the power of that language is something that we can't. Let me give you a personal example. When I moved to the US, and this is a social linguist professor at Columbia University, I was giving a presentation, and she corrected my accent. And this is the irony. She was teaching social linguistics and power. And she said, your presentation is good, but you're pronouncing some words wrong. And I counteracted, said, based on what version of dialect? But, so if a French person pronounces English wrong, it sounds romantic and sexy. If an Indian pronounces it wrong, they sound less educated and they need to be socialized, because language is power, as we know, and certain kinds of language taps into the whole colonial rubric of certain kinds of innate superiority based on accents, and it's a way of segmenting populations. And so we have to be very, very careful of it. We need to also get past it from ourselves, right? That domestication is about this instilling of inferiority. And I keep, of have I not got the right accent so I can get the better job, versus the content and the character of a person.
Thank you very much. That's the right point. Dr. Leena Jadhav from Pune. How can we encourage our students for self-organized learning?
Yes, I mean, firstly, tap into what are their passions and desires, right? And look, I'm not going to romanticize. This is the teachers are already, this is the problem, right? Teachers are already overwhelmed. So there's a lot of advice about do personalized education. It does not fit into the bandwidth because teachers on average get paid very low. They barely are coping with the classroom, and the classrooms are becoming very challenging and diverse, right? In terms of disabilities, they lump it all for efficiency. And I was part of the India Science Fair in January in Pune. And one of the things was, a good remark, look at the budget cuts in education. So on one hand, there's aspirations that let's get another MIT. On the other hand, you cut the budgets. And then you're like, what is India doing wrong? Let's not take the full responsibility, and a teacher cannot take the full responsibility of that. But going to the point of how do I still help my students is by creating assignments which allows for the personalized character rather than make, so you don't need to tailor it, but to attend to the fact and say, is this assignment going to have the creativity component, which allows students to put their own voice into it, versus regurgitating a material that, with that kind of skill is going to be less and less necessary for us to cope with automation. And I think we've already moving in the right direction if we do that.
Thank you. Dr. S. Rukimani, she wants to know whether digital platforms in education enhance self-thinking and creativity.
All technologies have double-edged swords, right? And of course, it can be deeply optimal, right? I mean, you can use it in a way in which, look at this forum right now. We are having a conversation, and I am so thrilled about this because even with my teaching now, I have a lot of external PhDs in Nigeria and India, and now they can participate in my class, and it's such a wonderful inclusive aspect. But also my own family members on WhatsApp sharing fake news and fake information, and we are the educated ones, right? My father's constantly spamming the family group with all sorts of rubbish, and I'm tired. I can't even question him anymore. So the point is that it goes both ways, and what we need to look at it is like saying that these are just tools. Let's humble technologies and understand its place. These are tools, and we are what make them, essential or non-essential. Or the way in which we utilize it can be devastating or liberating, and that's with any kind of tool or public space or institution.
Dr. Amol Padwar from New Delhi. When you say public education is a 21st century innovation, do you suggest that there were no attempts and practices in public education before?
It's a very good question, and absolutely not, right? But I'm talking about it in terms of the institutionalization of it, where where as a global, think about it, it's quite radical that around the world, it became a norm that this is a right, versus public education, of course, the notion, whether it's in Rome, in Greece, or in India itself, in the Gurukul system at some point. But remember, even then, right, what was public was deeply alienating. Women were not participating in it. If you were in the US, Black people couldn't participate in it because it was illegal in Ireland for the Irish to educate themselves. So if you look at the politics of education, because education equals power, and it goes alongside democracy. And remember, society is not linear, right? So we have been, at the time of Ashoka, there was a better kind of society, then societies became less. So we go in waves, but we hope the wave is going like this and not, like this, right? And which is true, because the fact is we've reached a point, even if we don't have genuine public education, it's not up for question. If you ask an average person, should an average person, any person, have the right to an education? It will be very hard to argue against it. But a century ago, it was very normal saying, oh, women can't handle knowledge, especially kinds of knowledge, medical knowledge. They will faint, they can't cope with it, right? So there's all these sort of constructs which deeply kind of narrowed, and look at the colonial construct, by the way. That itself is pretty astounding, that India, only a select few people based on caste, based on a certain, were given civic positions and were sent abroad, to be learned, which created the divide and rule policy, right? Which is why the British were able to rule India for 2 centuries, is because they created the internal divisions in a deep manner, right? And so it wasn't a privilege. And it was a privilege. And why? Why education shouldn't be a privilege? It should be a right, right? So yes, absolutely, it's not, that has never happened, but the idea that it's a norm is a 21st century.
Yes. And here is a burning question from R. Janki. She says, how do we maintain a human connect during the online classes?
In fact, I think what is so bizarre on one hand, and this is something I've been thinking about by just experiencing it in the last few months, just like many of you. I've been also working at home most of the time, and a lot of my classes have gone online. And on one hand, I feel, oh, it's so alienating because I don't meet people. I don't get to, there's a sort of a charisma you feel. Like I sort of feed off the energy of human beings in a classroom. I feel like I'm more dynamic, I'm more engaging. On the other hand, I noticed that it's much more participatory. Like a lot of students who had questions would not raise it. I bet here also, like I get to hear many of the different voices. And I bet if we were in a conference, and all these pretty nice chairs and all things, it's so hyper formal. I'll be on a stage up there. It's very intimidating. And it's a sort of a sort of structured power asymmetry which dissuades the connect. So we have actually got more of a connect in a sense because it sort of puts us in a kind of less of a power asymmetry and more on an even playing field. And I like that, I think. So people connect with me through personal messages, and I really, really have begun to appreciate that a lot. And they tell me their stories. That's something I don't get, right? Like you don't get to hear a person's story because they can think about it, they can communicate with that. And I like that. And they can continue the conversation. And that is really special.
To this, with your permission, I would like to add that C.J. Bonk is a critical thinking expert, and he is going to conduct a webinar in the first week of July. That would be focusing on how to handle online learning. So from the participants, if anybody is interested, you could search for C.J. Bonk webinar and you would be able to find it and attend it. Yes. Moving on to the next question, Payal. Professor Rajnikant Jain is asking, is this time of online teaching, how to make online learning possible? So he is maybe moving on to the other side.
Well, I mean, look, it comes from multiple sides. One is, of course, it's about data. It's not just, how we have this digital divide. It's all about access to computers, access to broadband, access to, networks, etc. Now it's reached a whole different level. Like even in the Netherlands, a wealthy country, I got an email last week saying, you need to clear up some of your data and they wrote it. They said, look, data, the more we buy storage space for the data, the less we have for education, for salaries, for investing in people, right? And this is from a wealthy public funded institution. And so of course, we are in a different kind of economy. And so we have to think in terms of the financialization of education tied to technology. So online education, in that sense, the state needs to be subsidizing and working with it, because then we're going to create deep, like even entrench further inequality based on who can afford it, right? So in a sense, public education will become more and more privatized, as I brought up. Then, of course, online education in terms of, I look at it as an opportunity to assess the way in which we do teaching, because we tend to do a lot of lecture style, but it's really hard. I mean, like, as you know, if you're talking, they can get it on they can get the best talks on, YouTube, TEDx, whatever, right? So it's not about dissemination. In fact, let's be humble about it. If we feel somebody else has said something better, share that video and use this time for discussion by able to like engage it like this. It's like, how many children get to have this kind of conversation? That's the role of, is to be able to bring together a community where we think things through. And I think that's something that, and the space and the time that we can allow for that kind of thinking, because that there is no other space. They can't get that at home. We can't take that for granted. That is the role of public education, is we need to carve that time. And this is why I think also lifelong education in a way, because politics and all what is going on right now needs processing. And that way we can respond to hate speech, misinformation in a way which is far more critical than we are doing now, right?
Yes. And just in connection to what you are saying, Aziz Bakali, says, will it be a massive change in education in the post-COVID, even for the communities with less income?
I really hope so, because it is, it's not like it hasn't been happening in terms of the inequalities, but it is surfaced in a way that that we can't even look at it without feeling shame that this kind of inequality exists at such a basic level, right? So there's a lot of pressure for governments to start to open up ideas like immediately and push for digital access, to be able to enable these people to get devices, to get data plans which are working for them, to get them into the fold and get them connected, create partnerships, including even like, and there's a host of other institutions like mobile payments, which are controlled by more for the government, so it can be subsidized. So who owns the data, the nationalization, there's opened up this host of conversation by unraveling things which we hold very dear, which is education and healthcare, right? And of course, political participation, which are the pillars of a democracy. So, I really am optimistic that this kind of disruption at least is sort of not just naming and shaming, but will sort of, evolve to actually restructuring and redesigning, so let's wait and hope. But also, of course, it's up to all of us
Yes.
to put that kind of pressure to make sure that happens and say, well, it didn't, right? So.
Since you have done, I mean, this is from my side, you have worked in different kind of researches in India, connected, I mean, with reference to the previous question, where do you see India in this COVID-19 era as far as education is concerned?
So, I work, so with this FemLab co-project, I work with a lot of young people in Bangladesh and India and across from Delhi to Hyderabad, Bangalore, etc. And I had to say, like, so in the last year particularly, I have been traveling a lot on my book tour, so numerous states, and I've been there for so long. I've met so many young people who are burning with, they are so ambitious for their life, and which is sort of funny because when I come to the Netherlands, the youth take it for granted. So they're like, I'm not working weekend. I'm not going to attend a webinar from 8 to 11. That's only Indian. So I was talking at a Design Up conference, and it went on to 11. There was 500 participants, young people who are doing it after their job. And that's the kind of material we have, is that there is no way to compete. And I often tell my students here, you can't compete with that kind of energy, that kind of determination, because there's this deep hunger. And, they can take this much and take it really far. The problem is we're not even giving this much, right? And so each of us, and I had to say the webinars and this adoption of webinars, and me participating in this kind of forum is like, it's my own personal sort of give back, that I want to be doing this kind of stuff, connecting more with students. In fact, I've also started supervising external PhDs there out of my regular workload, because it's so rewarding to see that insane amount of passion where people are doing this in spite of being a mother or having children also, and having a job and then doing this. So actually, it's very, very humbling. So I have a lot of optimism, let me say.
Thank you.
I feel that we need to step up our game and enable that optimism, because it would be such a shame if we don't do that.
Definitely. And I assure you that most of us, I mean, all of the teachers in India have started doing that for the students. That's for sure.
Well, it's not the teachers as much as, the institutions that need to change, because I feel teachers are part of also the ones who are victims in this, because like I said, they are overloaded, so it's really about institutional change and different ways of being enabled and supported. Well, and we need better support infrastructures here.
So what I'm saying is, like what's there in our hand. And perhaps
that's
we're trying
true.
to do
that's
that.
true, of course.
Kavita is asking to tell her various ways by which we can make online education useful in rural areas as far as our country is concerned.
Yeah, so one is that we need to rethink the relationship between traditional media and new media. So of course, there's a lot of focus on TikTok, WhatsApp, ways in which we can connect. So you need to look at, firstly, map out the different technologies at play. And let's not underestimate radio and television. Because, we think that, in this age, it's about mobile phones. No, it's a relationship between old and new media, which is going to make this happen. Like a case, just one example, right, is look at what China is doing. They're using television, broadcasting they hired the top lecturers in chemistry, the ones who teach the top schools in China, and are broadcasting this at multiple levels at times during the day for children on television. So this is the lecture format in also different dialects, etc. And we can do that, right? And then you design, so you're not giving the lecture, you're not giving the content, and then you supplant it with some links to, enhancing and extending that, knowledge. And then your role is to see how we can engage with it in a critical manner. So I think that's really it, is understanding our students, gathering their questions, and then so we should actually turn it around. So let them put that first. So it'll be a 3-tier thing. Let them get the television viewing of the top lectures and subject, then use social media like WhatsApp and these kind of messaging apps to gather the kinds of questions, give them resources to first do self-organized learning, like let's see how much they can address it themselves and help each other out, peer learning. And then last is you facilitating and catalyzing these in a way which can push it further.
Yes. The audience that we have right now is engaged in teaching the adult learners. So a few tips for them.
Yes, so one is, of course, that as adult learners, as an audience, is that we have to stop underestimating their intelligence, their kind of knowledge, the kind of knowledge they want to learn, right? So there is a sort of a patronizing of elderly people, like, they're less smart, or they're like, they won't get this, etc. But actually, if you even look at the KPMG report from last year, there was a 16% growth in mobile video, content absorption by the elderly, which is really was a shock. Because actually what's happening is, the old traditional that, parents or grandparents will let the younger ones, take care of them and or do it for them. No, the elderly are tired of being dependent on their kids. One is the nuclear family thing. Both the wife and the husband often are working, children are busy, going to tuition, and they are tired of being dependent. There's a sense of autonomy. So change who they are, their motivations. I think that's a first step, right? And second is, again, just like any other learner, see what is it that they want to learn. Because the idea is, do they want to learn their own TikTok videos? My own mother wanted to. So my mother asked me, can you teach me? Remember, she has this phobia. She's in her late 60s. She's in Bangalore. She has a phobia. She gets stressed out if I talk about technology. And now she tells me, she's like, I got inspired. I want to set up my own exercise channel on TikTok for plus 60 women because they all think we don't exercise. How can you exercise while watching TV? I'm like, okay. So she wants to create these little short videos. And so it's funny. So we're trying to do that. And the thing is, we should understand that even they are evolving. And as they live longer, they will actually see themselves in a different light, right? And so, yeah, so I think that, but there are many other examples. I just want to start with that.
Yes. And lastly, any warnings as far as online teaching is concerned?
Look, I think there's always going to be problems. There's always going to be, like, whether it's Zoom bombing, right? You're going to have maybe pornography coming in, or a lot of tension in the classroom, etc. These are normal. It's not about problems that come up. It's how do we cope with these problems? And without not taking it personal, not making it personal, and to use it as an opportunity for instruction. If we can just do that, because even with pornography, right? Okay, so it's about sex. Even I would even say, so why do we feel uncomfortable with sexual content? Is sex bad, or is it certain kinds of sex? It's like, turn it around. Even in the worst case scenario, turn it around, because you know what? That's what we're training, is what we're teaching implicitly is how to learn and cope in adverse situations. And that's the takeaway for them, right?
All right. So thank you very much, Payal, for your
you.
inputs, and thanks a lot for your time. Our participants have benefited a lot. And this video, when it goes on YouTube, it's going to, be something that people would watch and learn as far as online teaching and learning is concerned. So thank you very much once again.
And I appreciate everyone for making the time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
See you.